Hello and welcome. We have an interesting panel coming up, and this panel is about cannabis and law. We want to take the opportunity to thank our panelists that are on. May I ask Hilary to please switch on her camera, and Shira, if you can switch on your camera as well.
Hi, good morning, everyone.
Hi, good morning, Shira. Are we getting your camera feed yet? They're
Not yet.
okay.
Okay.
There we go. Perfect. Thank you. Okay, so hello, everyone. Welcome to the program. I want to take a moment to introduce our panelists. We have Andrew Murhoff. Andrew, I'm going to come back to you in a second to introduce yourself. Hilary Bricken, and we have Chira, who is representing Dr. Gamberry. So we take it from here. Andrew, if you could start this off and give us a little introduction about yourself.
Thanks so much, Anand. A pleasure to be here. Thank you, everyone, for attending. My name is Andrew Murhoff. I am a member of the State Bar of Michigan in the United States, although I reside in Canada and I'm a Canadian. And I'm the CEO of Strainprint Technologies. We're the leading real-world evidence cannabis research platform across the world. And we have been gathering real-world evidence on cannabis use in Canada and across the world since 2016. Today, over 2 million patient-reported outcomes, 9 peer-reviewed journal articles on our data, and happy to report that we've helped almost 100,000 patients across the world to use cannabis more effectively and to understand which strains of cannabis work best for them.
That's terrific. Thank you so much. Hilary, if we can have you give a brief introduction about yourself, please.
Sure. Hi, my name is Hilary Bricken. I'm a lawyer in private practice here in Los Angeles, California. I'm licensed to practice in Florida, Washington, and California. I've practiced in the area in all 3 states over the past 12 years. We've represented literally hundreds of clients of all sizes in pursuit of cannabis licenses under state legal licensing regimes, all under the dark cloud of federal illegality, which has posed some interesting issues over the years that I'd be happy to discuss today. So thanks for having me.
Wonderful. Shira, I'll have you give an introduction about Dr. Gamberry and about yourself, and then let's go from there.
Hi, everyone. My name is Shira. I am acupuncturist in California, and I also study about medical cannabis from Pacific College in San Diego. And my sister is Dr. Gamberry. We are the one that fight with government in Thailand to legalize the cannabis. My sister named Gamberry. She is the founder of Cancer Hope Village that we helping people underprivileged in Thailand that they have cancer or any other disease, but we use cannabis to helping them in Thailand. And right now, Thailand be the first country in the Southeast Asia that legalized cannabis to be the medical cannabis right now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for your introduction. Cannabis and the law is a complicated subject. As Hilary so aptly pointed out, in the US, we find it in 2 ends of the spectrum. On one side, we are obviously legal in some states for different uses, but yet federally we still are illegal. Andrew, of course, in Canada, it's a different story, and in Thailand, it's slightly different. So we'll have an interesting kind of global perspective on laws and how it affects. But first, let me come back to you, Andrew, with a question. Do you see cannabis and the law continuing a conflict, or is this something that we must accept for the betterment of humanity, for the betterment of medicine, for the betterment of our lifestyles in general?
So, you know, we first of all, the people have spoken that you know, across the world that you know, attitudes have changed. But regardless of that, the main treaties and the main prohibitions on cannabis throughout time have always been, and by the way, it's only been illegal since 1927. So throughout mankind, we've been using cannabis as a therapeutic, and there's record of that in many historical records. So long story short is we will continue to gather data and prove that cannabis works medicinally. So let me back up. Sorry, the main prohibitions against cannabis is that there were no medical purposes whatsoever to them, and that they would be cataloged or scheduled, if you will, the same as things like heroin and other dangerous narcotics. Cannabis is not, it's a plant. And there's plenty of medical evidence that it works for various indications. It doesn't work for everything, and it doesn't work for everyone. But we have plenty of data that shows that it works, and plenty of data shows that there are very little adverse reactions to its, to its use. So the prohibition today is purely political.
Hi, Andrew. I have one more question for you. My name's Abhi. It's great to meet you. It's a pleasure to be talking to all of you guys. We've seen so much discourse and information recently in recent times, you know, media, social media, all that stuff. And I guess I wonder if you can go into how that's, you know, trickled over to cannabis. It is because there's been so much more accurate information that's come forth in the 60s, 70s, 80s about it than maybe, you know, the 40s and 50s than there was about it. And then recently, have you seen more misinformation or more truthful information regarding it?
So part of prohibiting the use of cannabis has been the prohibition on research of cannabis, and primarily driven out of the United States. Outside of the United States, research has continued to evolve on cannabis. And Israel was leading the course with that from the 60s on. But there was research done in the US, and I apologize for not having the actual details around that, but there was research done in the US showing that it was actually beneficial to use. So I don't think, I think people are, I hate to use this phrase, there's so many of these in our industry, but people are weeding through the garbage and the noise, and they're actually understanding that that cannabis is beneficial. There are 32,000 articles on PubMed about cannabis research. That's more than any other drug of any kind. So there's plenty of information out there. The fact that it's being negatively highlighted in certain spaces is waning. We're only seeing positives, at least where we sit today, we're only seeing positive reinforcement for the use of it. And that's how we got today. That's why we're seeing legalization, right? It wouldn't have happened if not for this.
Yeah, understood. Hilary, coming to you and more with your background in helping people get medical cannabis licenses or cannabis licenses in general, what are your thoughts on the regulatory environment at state levels in the United States?
Well, it's a patchwork quilt of regulation. And if you're familiar with alcohol, beverages, spirits, it's really on track in the United States to follow that pattern where the horse has left the barn and the federal government, for better or worse, has really been hands off, with the exception of a few select enforcement cases, essentially since 2013 when Colorado and Washington legalized. So going forward, it's highly likely that the states are going to maintain their autonomy and their ability to reform policy and create their own little kingdoms of regulation, even if we have some kind of loose skeletal federal framework, which is almost identical to liquor in this country. And the states don't reinvent the wheel. They borrow from each other. Whenever a state legalizes, they crib off of that regulatory roadmap, whether it's a people's initiative or voting in the legislature, to try to improve on the program every single time. So by the time we legalized, for example, in California, we were borrowing from multiple other states' regulatory regimes, and we have some unique aspects that other states do not have, and they'll never have it. And there'll probably be an instance where there are states that are completely and totally dry, that are similar to alcohol, where they don't allow alcohol on Sundays or only between certain hours or not at all. And cannabis is following that trajectory in the United States. And I remain confident, I've said it for a while, that the states are going to lead the way on policy innovation, for better or worse, and the feds will be there with some kind of general oversight, standardization, uniformity of products that move in interstate commerce, but that's going to be about it.
Chira, coming to you on this, if you can let us know a little bit about the struggle in Thailand of even getting to a medicinal license, and what kind of environment it took in order for Dr. Gambury to convince regulators to allow research and use of medical cannabis.
In Thailand right now, we are legalized the medical cannabis only. not is for medicinal, because we right now in the world change, and we have a lot of research that we can prove the cannabis is helping a lot of people. And FDA in Thailand, they follow the structure of America, that we start from the 5 of disease first: seizure, convulsion, epilepsy, or from the kid that have autistic first, only the some of the disease. And right now we spread for more of disease. And in Thailand, we use cannabis for like 300 years ago. Is it the herbal that everyone use it? And we also have the book that we write on that. We have 13 formula that we use the herb of cannabis with the food or with the decoction. That's why we still allow some of them, but government control everything. We don't have dispensary in Thai. We don't have the anyone can use it. It needs to come from the doctor only, doctor prescription.
I'd like to follow up, Chira. Hi. I have a more medical question, because there's generally 2 types of classes of cannabis. There's what's categorized as medical, and then psychoactive. And the CBD is usually categorized more as medical, but obviously, you know, psychoactive cannabis can be used by cancer patients. So I guess my question is, do you feel like the psychoactive cannabis is more used in recreational purposes versus CBD?
You mean for the CBD for the cancer patient?
Right. So if you were to take a look at cancer treatment that you are doing in Thailand, are you using full spectrum CBD? Are you using a combination of just cannabis, without any kind of assortment of CBD versus psychoactive? So what is the best use for cannabis in your cancer research?
Okay, in my foundation of cancer, if we use only CBD, because CBD is cannabinoids that we cut off the tetrahydrocannabinoid THC, but we have research from around the world, Israel, from America, the tetrahydrocannabinoid THC can help the cancer to confuse and eat themselves. But if we use only CBD, it's not working, because CBD is too less for cancer patient. Cancer patient, they like a lot of things coming off, like last stage cancer, something like that. But we have a lot of cases that we use the THC, the powder. They use it, and some of them, they get well from cancer. After that, they go check, because we are naturopathic. We are herbal medication, and we also work with the medical cannabis. Before they do the treatment, they have the blood test, and then we can see the tumor marker. After we prescribe the cannabis for them, and then we check the blood test again, the tumor marker go down. But we need to use combination with CBD and THC together.
Is better, yeah, that makes sense. Hilary, coming to you on that, California, of course, has a long history of regulation on cannabis, having had medicinal use cannabis for quite a while before the latest regulations. But when we look at today at cannabis in California, are we still looking at cannabis and saying it's Cheech and Chong in California and everybody is just high? And is that the image that's distorting the medicinal use of cannabis?
I'm sorry. We do get a bad rap here in California, mainly because we were the first state to, and we didn't legalize it. We created an affirmative defense and a constitutional right for patients to use medical cannabis in 1996, but we didn't actually implement any kind of licensing system. There was no government oversight. There were no checks and balances on these cultivators and ultimately dispensaries from city to city. That culture proliferated and is still around today. And we have a really big problem with licensed product being diverted into the illegal market and illegal operators refusing to get licensed because it's cost prohibitive, heavily taxed, and it's a pain to actually receive a license. So I wouldn't go so far as to say that the Cheech and Chong culture is incredibly pervasive. The issue that we have here is a massive illegal market that the state has tried now for years to come under control. And finally, they're realizing that the problem is really because of local control. Too many cities and counties are banning it because they have the constitutional right to do so with their police powers, and it's too heavily taxed. So we will very likely see something out of this legislative session that's backed by our governor to lower the taxes, because the culture has actually become more sophisticated and people use this for leisure, lifestyle. They also legitimately do use medical cannabis still, even though adult use has somewhat eclipsed it. But the real problem that we have in California is the illegal market. And that's not just us. We just happen to have the biggest one out of all the states.
And to follow up on that, it's not just the cost of taxation, but also the cost of the licenses themselves are extremely expensive.
That's correct. And part of that problem is local approval, because here in California, one of the things that we did, and not all states do this, is that you have to get approval from your city or county relative to your real estate, your land use, whatever you're going to do at a given location. And that tags on major, major costs. So for example, in the city of West Hollywood, it was a highly competitive process to receive a retail license. And this is the forward-facing license that deals with the public brick and mortar storefront. They're very popular, obviously, and they're still unique at this point with federal prohibition in play. That price tag, just to get that license, to prepare in the competitive licensing process, was hundreds of thousands of dollars if you were serious, because we had very large, well-capitalized interests coming from out of state, even internationally, to get a piece of West Hollywood, which is obviously a very popular location in LA, huge tourist destination, but it was incredibly expensive.
And there's not an unlimited number of licenses. There's a finite number that they're going to basically pick and choose.
Well, that's the interesting thing. At the state level, it's like a liquor license. It's open year round. We don't have any caps. Other states have caps. They limit licenses. They institute prohibition on vertical integration. It's the cities and the counties that are limiting the supply of licenses, if they even allow them at all.
Andrew, let's switch to a more global focus, since you have so much research and data on this, looking beyond the United States, but having United States play a large role in this because of the federal prohibition. And then that, of course, comes down to use of funds from people that are cannabis related outside of the US, et cetera, et cetera. There's almost a ripple effect that the federal regulation in the US creates globally, which has everything to do with import, export, taxation, money laundering, all of these very complex financial and tax issues. And what are your thoughts on this?
So two things. I'll tell you a firsthand story about a banking situation. But first, I want to say, the prohibition on at the federal level limits the competitiveness of the U.S. on an international scale. So in Canada, we can export across the world to legal markets. In the U.S., you cannot export or import any contraband across borders, right? Even amongst the states, you can't cross state lines, which is part of the challenge for American operators. Across the world, Australia has a national program. We have a federal program in Canada. We've had a medical cannabis program in Canada since 2001, which was designed a little bit different. It was actually because of a court case that worked its way up, so that's a little bit different. At the end of the day, the ripple effect is hitting everybody. So as an example, we did business with the 5th largest bank in the world called Royal Bank of Canada. It's one of the 5 national banks in Canada. They've been our banker since we launched in 2016. I've been banking with them for 25 years in my other businesses. About a year ago, they came to us and they said, who are these companies that you're receiving funds from? And by the way, we do all of our business virtually, especially since COVID, but all of our banking's done virtually. So most things are done by e-transfer or wire. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of compliance that we and our banks have to monitor. And we receive payments. People buy data from us and they buy use of our research platform to run their own studies. We have many studies happening across the US, and they're with state licensed legal providers in those states. But because it's illegal at the federal level, that's technically proceeds of crime when they pay us. And so our bank canceled us. And we had to find a local bank that did not have an international nexus. So the reason RBC was concerned about it was because we're a very small player and they could be at risk of liability because they have operations in the US. So there's a very real situation that has impacted us that required us to change our banking just because even though we're only doing business with legal entities, and even though we don't produce cannabis, we don't retail cannabis, we don't market cannabis, all we are is a technology company. So ripple effect right through to us.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting question. Chira, I'll bring that over to you. I know that Dr. Camberry has tremendous products, both on the CBD side as well as full spectrum. Yet, you know, import and export of some is allowed, some is not allowed, and it's a very difficult and costly thing to do. And so then, you know, how do you handle that kind of scenario?
Because cannabis is not legal in the federal level yet, but even in USA, we only allowed to do in the state, right? But we are doing in Thailand. We have the license that we can grow, we can plant, and we can produce the product in Thailand. That's why we bring the people that have knowledge from America to build a new system in Thailand for them.
That's wonderful. Hilary, I think Andrew pointed out one of our biggest challenges in the US and around the world, and which is, what do you do with money? You know, you've got cannabis operators in various states. They're doing quite well, some of them. Maybe not so much, you know, obviously the California situation is slightly different, but banking has been a severe challenge. What is your outlook on banking and regulatory side? And is it all going to still depend on the feds to some point pass regulation, or are the states being proactive?
Well, this is a very complicated, nuanced question, and I have to take it from the top, which is that the federal government has made at least one concession about access to financial institutions and the movement of interstate money, and also being able to bank with depository accounts. And that takes the form of a Financial Crimes Enforcement Network memo from 2014 that basically sets the roadmap for financial institutions, banks, and credit unions to essentially bank state legal cannabis businesses, regardless if they're medical or adult use. It doesn't matter, as long as they have state licensing and they're in a state with robust regulation to basically control them and keep them under strict oversight. Certain financial institutions have been willing to bank them. That is the only viable solution that US cannabis companies have when it comes to the movement and deposit of their money. Note, that does not extend to things like commercial lending or credit cards or third-party payment systems. All of that is still illegal under federal law, violates the Bank Secrecy Act, constitutes money laundering, and potentially even constitutes a criminal enterprise under horrible statutes like RICO. So this is very serious business. It remains serious business, despite the fact that all DOJ guidance on cannabis in states has been rescinded by Jeff Sessions, who was the Attorney General under Trump for a while. The FinCEN guidelines live on. It is literally the only solution to the issue. It is not a good solution. What is really needed is federal reform. And my outlook would have been rosier had the Democrats been able to get through the Safe Banking Act, which was an act that essentially would have codified the FinCEN guidelines to freely allow for banking without violations of the BSA. And as we all know, financial institutions are skittish creatures. They're heavily regulated. So without that reform, we will never see Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, the very large financial institutions, banking licensed cannabis companies. They may do ancillary, like one of Andrew's companies, potentially, but even then, they're liable to close them because of potential violations of the Bank Secrecy Act and secondary and tertiary violations of the Controlled Substances Act, just by virtue of banking the cash. But you've identified probably the number one issue that's out there with the overall general inability to bank. And then the second issue at the federal level is obviously the tax situation, which is unique to the United States.
Right. We won't get into the taxation side of it because I think that's too complex a subject for us to address at this time. But I'm going to bring this back to you, Andrew, and say, look, one of the things that you brought up, which is a very real problem, is supply chain. So you may have certain times, and especially now with climate change and risk to crops. So you may have a time where, for instance, California may not have a good crop, but Colorado could have a tremendous crop. Yet we can't move product from one state to the other. And this is another kind of an interesting thing. When Germany wants something, they go to Israel. They don't come to us. It makes us uncompetitive. We have such great farming communities that could benefit so greatly from all of this, but we're not allowing them a revenue source. Yet the states are taxing them at what seems like extraordinary levels. To where, especially in California being the, probably the worst case study for this, it's making things uncompetitive with the illegal market. So what are your thoughts on that? And then I'll come back to Hilary with the same question.
Like Hilary, I thought we were going to get more traction in the last year or so, but unfortunately we're not. The reality is, certainly it limits competition. Sorry, it limits competitiveness, and it limits the ability for international commerce or even interstate commerce. But the reality is, it's really only impacting like 10 of the largest MSOs in the country, right? So those are the ones, right? But you can't build an industry. It's going to limit the growth of the industry, and it's going to limit the growth of the legal industry, because people are going to turn to illegal markets if product isn't available in the legal markets. But at the end of the day, not being able to cross state lines with your product really is a business. It'll limit the competitiveness of individual businesses. So, for example, the large MSOs would love to be able to produce in the warm states and ship anywhere across the U.S. to retail. They can't do that, so they have to be vertically integrated in every state that they're in. They have to be producers, they have to be retailers. Those are two very separate differences. It's hard to run a business that way. So really, in the country that is the most commercially minded of any country in the world, you're limiting this very industry that is the largest and fastest growing industry in the world right now.
Hilary, your thoughts?
Well, ironically, I think these democratic experiments, while they're an excellent exercise in civil liberties and teach us about states' rights versus the federal power, they've created these artificial bubbles of quote unquote competition that are not very competitive as a result of strictly intrastate movement. The other irony is that Andrew mentioned MSOs, which, for anybody who doesn't know, that stands for multi-state operator in the United States. They're probably the largest players on the spectrum. Having said that, we're not talking about Walmart or Costco-sized enterprises. These are really actually small companies when we talk about market share and cap relative to reality. Some of them appreciate the fact that we have federal prohibition, because they know once the veil drops and we have full-blown interstate commerce, the competition will ratchet up to a degree they've never experienced. Because at that point, technically, potentially, you could see retailers like CVS, Costco, Walmart start to enter the supply chain. And then things like dispensaries become dinosaurs of the past. Costs will plummet. It's a race to the bottom. That's how those companies make money in order to support the crappy margins. And it will upend everything that we see today. And I don't think that that's hyperbole. We know in DC that we have private interest groups that are lobbying that are quite serious, like the Koch brothers and Altria, right, which is big tobacco. They are not going away, and they are strategically placed for timing relative to when this is all going to come tumbling down. But some of those MSOs, I surmise, are actually happy that we have federal prohibition. And the little guys, the craft brands, I think some of them are happy about it too. Although they'll beat the drum for reform, it actually benefits them that these artificial bubbles are in place, because once those big boys truly come in, it's going to get a lot harder to survive.
Could I add, Anand, is the future of cannabis is not about the MSOs or the multi-state operators. The future of cannabis is big brands and is pharmaceutical. And the reality is, we're working with both of those groups, and the pharmaceutical companies they know that cannabis is going to eat into their margins on traditional medications, into their sales on traditional medications, and they're aching to get into this, but nobody's touching it until these issues are dealt with. Because at the U.S. level, even though they're global brands, because of the U.S. federal laws, they're very cautious, and and the same thing goes for the Johnson & Johnsons of the world and the big beverage companies. They're being very cautious about this, but once the walls come tumbling down, as Hilary said, it's going to upend everything, and it's those big players that are going to squash all the little guys, unfortunately.
Yeah, the last thing I'd like to address before we log off is just a quick thought. Hilary brought up the alcohol business, yet, from my understanding, or limited understanding, I understand that you can have a alcoholic beverage, but you cannot mix cannabis into it. This seems like an interesting, again, regulation where you could create a cocktail which would have CBD in it, but apparently you can't. What are your thoughts on this?
I'd be happy to jump in because we're doing beverage research on this right now. The reality is it's all political. From a medical perspective, alcohol is bad and cannabis is good. I mean, that's the generic way of looking at it, or that's a generalization, but there's no reason why you couldn't combine CBD in with hops and barley. It makes no sense.
Hilary, your thoughts?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was going to be prepared to talk about what regulations have become uniform across the states, despite the patchwork quilt. And obviously, alcohol and cannabis do not mix in a given can or container. However, with this very enterprising industry, these folks have figured out ways to kind of manipulate these regulations in that they'll create dry cannabis drink mixes like you would buy at the store. They don't already have alcohol in them. And then, of course, the consumer's left to their own devices to mix at home. So there's always a way to cut it to get around the regs. But yeah, it's a puritanical set of regulations. People are already mixing these substances together and taking the risk. The states are not perfect. They need to get with the 21st century of consumer psychology. I think they're on their way, but we do have antiquated regs like this that will always kind of be a thorn in the side.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for this discussion. I appreciate the candor and the knowledge contributed. Unfortunately, we're out of time and we're going to have to move on to our next panel. We will discuss this again in a year and take it from here. But please, just keep going, keep doing the work that you're doing, and hopefully we'll see the results that we all want. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.